and welcome to episode 27 of That Encyclopedia podcast with your hosts, Jacob and Will.
Hello.
Today we have another one of those articles that is, I think, quite unique. We're looking at an old leftover of common law that was enacted in England and then subsequently Great Britain, the UK, and its colonies and former colonies, that was explicitly misogynistic in tone and in execution, and was related to other ASBO laws, you could say, that were a bit more gender neutral, but when taken together, punished regular people for the tiniest of infractions. These are laws that, if they still exist, are no longer enforced, but they are notable, I think, not only for their design, but also for the creativity of their punishments. Today's article is called Common Scold, which is defined by Wikipedia as a type of public nuisance for which a troublesome and angry person breaks the public peace by habitually chastising, arguing, and or quarrelling with their neighbours. Most being women, but occasionally men could be punished as well. Well, do you know anyone who could be accused of being a common scold?
Wow, what a question to open with. Trying to see if I myself will deploy a term that you've already described as historically sexist. So I think I'll avoid that one and say, well, there's two answers. Either no, not really, or yes, pretty much anyone. And that's the problem. If you get in an argument, and if you can convince the powers that be that the person you argued with you deserves punishment, and maybe punishment they shall receive. Punishment in an interesting way, I do add.
Yeah, and it also suggests the existence of an uncommon scold or a rare scold, right? Like, what is common about this? The name confuses me.
That's true. I hadn't considered whether or not you can find a common scold, a rare scold, an epic scold, or even a legendary scold. But that's true. All obviously pertain to the act of scolding, which is chastising someone, criticizing someone. It sounds like the concept being driven at here, I guess, is the concept of a woman, possibly one's own wife, criticizing and quarreling excessively. Although this is obviously something you could accuse your neighbor of. So any petty argument, but preferably with a woman, you could then accuse someone of. So there are, obviously it says men could be found to be scolds, but it's always easier, to accuse a woman of being bossy, isn't it?
I think I think to some extent actually remains the case. It's not like we've eliminated sexism, but particularly in medieval contexts, to state the obvious, right? Like the concept of women's rights was like almost non-existent, and so yes, if you accused a woman of anything, their options for defense are extremely limited, both by law and by culture. This even could branch us off into specific periods of persecution, maybe most famously or infamously, I should say, something like the Salem witch trials. And actually, if you look at just to go on a tangent for a second, we will come back to this. If you look at one of the linked articles under Common Scold, in the second paragraph, it links to something called a scold's bridle, which is sort of like a gag almost, in the same way that you'd have a horse bridle, sometimes called the branks, that was used as a form of punishment for humiliation if someone was found to be a scold. But another term for a scold's bridle is a witch's bridle, which suggests a level of synonymity between scold and witch. So I think, all of these terms describe essentially a woman who disturbs the peace in some way. Would you like to explain to the listeners what sort of creative punishments were possible if you were found to have violated this most heinous of laws?
Yeah, so let's say you've been charged with being a common scold. What are we going to do with you? Well, we have a few options, but pretty much what we have to do, you've offended the public, so the public needs to see you humiliated. Or fined. I mean, sometimes it'll be a fine, so, okay, you're a scold, pay up, deal with it, move on, don't do it again. That's not so creative, that's a bit boring. People get fined all the time, people get fined today, that's not medieval. What we need is something interesting. Now, you mentioned the scold's bridle, which is quite interesting. It feels probably like the most relevant punishment to the crime, if you're going for not so much like an eye for an eye, but like okay, you've spoken wrong, so we're going to stop you from speaking, is quite literally the idea there, having a little iron muzzle on your head. But other options, popular one might be dunking. Now, dunking is often done, I don't know why, I always misread this one at the start, but dunking can be performed using a ducking stool, also known as a cucking stool, which is a chair on... I don't know why it's so elaborate, but they've got these wooden devices with wheels and a chair on the end of like a very low down crane, but at the end of the crane is a chair, and you put the scold in the chair and dunk them in the river or a pond. And then I think actually the purpose of the wheels was part of the ability to parade them in that chair through the street as a form of public humiliation. You may have been punished with the stocks, which I'm sure everyone's heard of. You get locked in a thing in the street, in a wooden and metal thing, and people might throw rotten vegetables at you. Although I'm not sure, not sure much about that, but I am aware of the ducking stool, because that's the one that really caught my eye when I was looking at this. There's in a way, like it can be funny to think about, because it's so bizarre as a way of punishing someone. It's not like a super violent thing. It's bizarre, and it's a form of humiliation, so it can come across as funny, but it's pretty weird, pretty disturbing to think about people actually wanting to deploy this. There's a description of a particular type of stool. Let me see if I can find one, because there's a description of one which exposes the backside of the person sat in it as well for extra humiliation purposes. But just in general, the concept is, okay, you've been an annoying person and you talk too much, so we're going to try and completely humiliate you in front of the town so that you don't do it again. Anything to add on the punishment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating bit of history, and it's the sort of thing that almost looks made up. Like if I told Stable Diffusion or Midjourney or some other AI-based program to create a medieval punishment in woodcut style, and it returned this image of someone tied to a chair, suspended by a pulley system above a river, while a bunch of dudes in like silly hats looked on, kind of looking smug and satisfied, I almost wouldn't believe it. So the fact that it's not only a real punishment for a real offence, but one worthy of its own Wikipedia article, if you want to look at ducking stools, they do exist on Wikipedia as well, is quite surprising to me. I think what I took away most from this, though, is how what's the term, blatant or brazen some of the accusations levied were. It was common in this time, sort of the medieval period, I should say, for a load of offences to be jointly issued against the accused, and it would be a mighty task for them to kind of defend their way down to completely clear their name. So if you levied an offence like being a common scold, you would probably also levy an offence at the same time of like fornication, and of being a thief, and of committing assault, and of trading without a license, and so on. But even within, and this applied to both men and women, but even within this context, the descriptions that the article offers differ hugely depending on whether the defendant is a man or a woman. For example, the article lists a story of one Mr. and Mrs. Bradwall in 1434. And they jointly, but mostly Mrs. Helen Bradwall, accused Mr. and Mrs. Wellerson of Middlewich of being common scolds. For what crime, beyond just running their mouths, apparently? This is lost for time. But what we do know is that Isabel and Hugh fought back, and accusations ran wild between the four individuals and the two parties. Helen and Peter accused Hugh of being a scallot knave, scallot being an old term for wretched, which is like, okay, sure, what a classic medieval insult. I'm sure that was a sick roast back in 1434. Did they also accuse Isabel of being a scallot knave? No. They accused her of being a child murderer, which strikes me as slightly more serious than being a scallot knave. I don't know about you, Will. But if you had to be like, but for these two descriptions, one is a scallot knave, one is a child murderer, you're both charged with the same offence, which is being a common scold. Like, is that, if I murder a child, does that make me a common scold? It's bizarre how these laws were applied. It seems
well, you can't argue that it's
much
not mean to murder a child, and what else is a common scold?
Well, yeah, precisely. I mean, it's
charged with meanness.
These medieval laws and punishments seemed very arbitrary. I think that's the point I'm trying to whittle down to. As you mentioned, that I can see a degree of what you might want to call poetic justice, like, oh, you've been found guilty of running your mouth, so we're going to literally gag you with like a steel device. I can see the dramatic irony in doing that, but there's no consideration really to proportionality or even what being a scold actually means. It seemed like the equivalent of what we have in the UK, or at least in England at the moment, called antisocial behaviour, or an ASBO, which is, I think, maybe the successor to being a common scold, although it's normally associated not so much based on sex, but based on age, where normally you would imagine someone who is kind of charged or found to be committing antisocial behavior is like a youth, after dark, just like graffitiing park bins or something. I think it's a relatively
music
recent,
on their Bluetooth speaker.
Yeah, I think it's a relatively recent offence that is kind of a catch-all power for the police to just deal with generic nonsense that people commit whilst out in public. And in that sense, it seems like a successor to being a common scold, although this crime of being a common scold wasn't just for... Well, it says, the first sentence claims that it was a type of public nuisance, but when you read the historical context, it's also clear that it was used very much to punish private actions. Like when people are being accused of fornication and child murder, I think the idea behind this is that they're being accused of doing it at all, not just doing it in public.
I had a point of clarification that you may be able to help with myself and with any listeners. See, I've heard this term come up a lot. Common law. What is common law?
So it's common law is kind of almost like a legal philosophy, or like style of law that you can find in many countries that were part of the British Empire, and it's sort of it's a collective term for laws that have been created by judicial process rather than through legislative process, if that makes sense. So if Parliament, I am not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, etc., etc., but my understanding is if Parliament, for example, passes a bill that is a piece of legislation, and then that gets signed into royal assent by, in our case, the king, but it could be the president or whoever the head of state is, that then becomes law. That is now the law, and that is law that has been enacted by the legislature, that is by elected representatives normally, whose job it is to create, modify, rescind, and otherwise manage the laws of the land. But if this law or an aspect of this law is contested and finds its way to the courts, judges under a common law system have the ability to state or write opinions that have legal force behind them, in acknowledgement of their qualifications as senior members and experienced members of the judicial system. In such a case, these opinions can set precedents that become legally binding. So you can essentially create laws, or in practice create laws, or codes that apply to laws through judges without an elected representative ever actually looking at them, if that makes sense. This term of letting the judicial system modify the laws as they go is called a common law system. I suppose you can most famously see it in something like the US Supreme Court, where they're not elected representatives in any way, the Supreme Court justices, but everyone follows their major cases extremely closely, because if the Supreme Court weighs an opinion on something, they can essentially rescind laws. Relevant to this episode about a sexist law would be the essentially the revocation of the Roe v. Wade case in the US, which is normally considered to be the Supreme Court case that legally protected or constitutionally protected the right to abortion in the first trimester in the US. Even then, that wasn't a law. Like, it's not enshrined as constitutionally protected, but it was interpreted to be constitutionally protected through the Supreme Court, and now this Supreme Court has reversed that decision. So the authority of senior judges to dictate what the law is within the confines of existing legislation is a common law system.
Okay, well, that was a good explanation.
I think. May I talk a little bit about the history of being a common scold? Because I think I just wanted to mention that it's not something that's existed since time immemorial. I think this is often a mistake, or at least an inclination that people often have when they think about what life was like and what the laws were like in medieval times, because it's unusual for someone to think before medieval times. I'm certainly guilty of this. There's a temptation to kind of think, oh, you know, whatever, Stone Age, Iron Age, or Bronze Age, Iron Age, and then like, meh, not sure, big gap, and then knights and horses and things. In reality, the evolution of the legal system is quite fascinating, and being a common scold is not something that existed, say, during the Anglo-Saxon period. It developed in the late Middle Ages in England, and one historian has suggested that it actually evolved as an attempt to control and punish, quote, bad speech after the Black Death epidemic that affected England in 1348. So the fallout from this epidemic led to enormous demographic shifts because so many people died. Workers were more powerful because the peasantry was smaller, and so their labour was more valuable. This meant that the threat to the status quo of England was heightened, and so it was important for elites to be able to control speech and behaviour more strictly in order to reduce this threat. And so this punishment of being a common scold, which, as we've been discussing, explicitly refers to negative forms of speech, gossip, hearsay, quarrelling, chatter, was popularised partially in order to sustain the momentum of the status quo. Now that is just the opinion of one historian, but it does seem to be the case that before the Black Death, before 1348, this offence didn't exist in any meaningful way. And personally, I think it's quite a convincing argument, and a bit of interesting legal history as well.
Yeah, I've always been interested in the history around the Black Death. Quite a lot of things in society changed. Well, they had to change because of just how many people died. Question is, where do we take our thoughts next? We've got a little bit of time.
Well, I would ask you probably whether you felt that there were any laws in existence today that you're aware of, either in the UK or abroad, that you feel might be judged harshly in the future. Any sort of law, not just public nuisances, but could I get your opinion on current legal the current legal situation?
Yeah, got some bait here. Well, we're young people, right? So the go-to is drugs. Drugs.
You know, I was thinking the same thing.
Criminalizing people for possession of drugs. There's more, though. I think more broadly, I'd say one thing that I don't know what direction we'll move in the future, but it's of my impression that in a lot of countries, the justice system is, well, it's called a justice system, right? It's not, the goal of the justice system is whatever people think justice is. Now, in my mind, I would want a justice system that works towards the best outcome for society, and for me, the best outcome is to reduce the incidence of crime in the first place, and part of that is a rehabilitation focused system. And I don't know how well a lot of countries manage their rehabilitation. I think we can often get very focused on, we've had a surge in this type of crime. I'm a politician. Let me say we need tougher sentences for XYZ person, without any real evidence that it will do anything to affect the incidence of that crime. So I find that a bit ridiculous because, you catch some people and you keep them off the street. Okay, is it worth it? I mean, if you could try and rehabilitate them or spend money on other things that could try and prevent these crimes from happening. When someone's in prison, it is very expensive to keep them in prison, irrespective of whether or not you care about that person and their own liberty. See, it all gets very deep, you know. Like, I don't think that just because someone's committed a crime that they should lose all of their freedom from all of their civil liberty. But just in general, you know, prison's expensive. It's expensive to keep people in prison, but it's also unjustified to then use prisoners for free labor. So what are you going to do? You know, you want to keep someone in prison, it costs you. So how about we try and keep fewer people in prison, only the people that we really need? But then I'll hand the drugs one over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm no stoner by any stretch of the imagination, but I just think there's economic argument in following maybe a Portuguese approach to drugs legislation, whereby illegal drugs are no longer illegal. Not necessarily the same as making them legal, but just decriminalized, such that power is taken away from, ultimately, drug cartels that facilitate the manufacturing, growth, distribution of things like cocaine, which require specific growth environments that are not easily replicated by people outside of cartel territory. It's very difficult, I think, for people to reconcile sometimes the ultimate kind of supplier of any drugs that they might take. And I think rather than trying to enact some vast police security web of equal or greater complexity to counteract it, the simplest thing to do would be to pull the rug out from under everyone's feet and just decriminalize everything, make its use regulated, make treatment available and consequence free, in order to ensure that the people who need help from drug addiction receive it in the most efficient and effective way, and the people who want to indulge for their own, personal choice, can do so in a way that is not as safe as can be. And for kind of weaker drugs, relatively speaking, things like marijuana, it's just economically beneficial, I think, to legalize them. Maybe 15 years ago, that was a bit of a theoretical argument because we didn't really have many examples. But these days, half the states in the US have followed this route, and all of them have publicly reported that they're making tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for not just the state, but the people who live in it, for the vendors and shopkeepers who previously, if you've been a weed dealer all your life, previously you are basically a petty criminal in the eyes of the law, and you're risking a lot. and you can't declare your income and all this sort of thing. And now you're a legitimate business owner, and no one seems to have rioted or died as a consequence of this. It just seems like a no-brainer to me. Get a bit of extra money, everyone wins, everyone's happy.
Yeah, I mean, like the before we end, I think the obvious question that I would anticipate from someone who's a bit more hesitant on that side of things is what the impact of decriminalisation is in terms of the sort of rate of consumption of those drugs, because they are, well, not all, but some of these controlled substances are controlled for reasons of protection of the consumer and the public. So yeah, I might be interested to know. But then again, it's hard to even get research on it. You don't know how many people are consuming an illicit substance because who's asking? So when you make something legal, you would expect to see more people admitting to taking it. But are more people taking it? Because if it's harmful, maybe they shouldn't be. Although that said, I still lean more towards the liberal approach. Although I'm not sure that the UK electorate is that close to it yet.
Yet. One day, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Yeah. But until then, I think that slightly tangential conclusion leads us to the end of this episode of that Encyclopedia podcast. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time. And if you haven't already, check out our shorts. We're making them now. We hope you like them. Bye.